Hello, everyone. I'm Miss Gian, and today we're diving into chapter 4, which is the fundamentals in test and testing. So, we've already established that psychological tests are everywhere, right? So, what is it for? They help us decide who gets hired, who gets into certain programs, what type of schools are you better suited for, or even kasi makakuha sa custody sa bata no when with regards to court cases. So understanding the fundamentals of tests and testing and what makes it good, what could go wrong is a key foundation for you to have, right? So let's get into it. Here's what we are going to cover today. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to first explain the 7 fundamental assumptions underlying psychological testing and assessment. Then second, you'll be able to define reliability and validity. It's the two words that you'll hear constantly in this field and explain why both of them matter, not just, reliability. And then third is we'll talk about norms. What are they? Why do we need them? And what happens when we use the wrong norms? And fourth, correlation and regression. I will not promise, but I will try my best to make it as simple as possible. And then we'll talk about what these statistics actually mean in the context of testing. Hopefully, you're already acquainted with correlation and regression, so it will be easy for us to refresh and discuss what these terms or statistics mean. And then finally, you'll understand the difference between norm reference and criterion reference tests. So these are two very different ways of interpreting what a test score actually tells us, but more on that later. So, before we can even talk about specific tests, we need to understand the assumptions that make psychological testing possible. So, why are there assumptions? What's the use for assumptions in psychological tests or psychological testing? These assumptions, they exist to justify why psychological testing is possible and defensible as a scientific practice. Okay, if we don't have these assumptions, what is our grounds to create measures that intends to create a numerical value out of a construct? So, dili siya law, as mentioned, because wala man tayo laws sa social sciences. We just have assumptions, principles, diba? Mga premises. So, let's go first sa first assumption, which is that psychological traits and states actually exist. Now, this seems obvious, right? It seems like common sense, but we're talking about things like intelligence, anxiety, personality. So these are the things that you can't see or touch directly. Now, this assumption establishes that psychological characteristics are real constructs and not just imaginary labels. And number two, this is that these traits can be quantified and measured. So this assumption tells us that whatever the traits are identified here or emerged as society progresses and changes, then we can in some way measure it and put numbers on it. Now, this justify converting these abstract concepts, these constructs, into numerical scores, and then allows us to compare and analyze the scores. Now, how do we quantify and measure them? First, there are technical considerations to establish. For example, the way that you write the item, the reliability score, or the Cronbach alpha score. And then the second one is your construct definition, right? So, unsay mo pag-conceptualize sa construct? What theory did you base it on? Okay, so what observations in real life did you base it on? Do you have data? So number three is also the value that society attached into it, particularly with the cutoff scores, right? So kaysa may mabuot na at this type of percentile naa ka sa low score or low intelligence score, and then this type of percentile naa ka sa genius level na intelligence score. So mo na siya ang assumption number two. Now number three is how someone behaves on a test predicts how they'll behave outside the test. Or mo silang assumption no na kung unsa man ang gibehave nila in their day-to-day life, it is shown in the test. So test-related behavior predicts non-test behavior. And this assumption also says na it could be two, right? It could predict behavior, but test could also post-dict behavior. So sa post-dict, it's to be able to understand what is the cause for that behavior after the behavior has been done. So this is usually conducted in forensic psychology tests. So ultimately, assumption number three, if you looked at it, predict behavior, post-dict behavior, it ultimately ends to us trying to understand why a behavior occurred or will occur or when will it occur, right? Number four, is tests have strengths and weaknesses. So every strength they have a limitation, and no test is perfect. No test is precise in its way of measuring a certain construct. So there is always a limitation with regards to the test that we will employ. And then number five is that error is always part of the process. Always. Okay, so we'll talk more about this in the next few slides. But I want you to look back, and I want you to understand that when we say error, it's not a mistake. It's not defined as a mistake. In common language, we usually say it's an error, so it's a mistake, right? But in testing and assessment, in psychometrics, an error is not a mistake. It is a naturally occurring thing which should be accounted for. Okay? So hope that's clear. And then number six is that testing can be done fairly and without bias. Though this is definitely the most controversial one. Why, man? Because I want you to look back and think of what happened at Ellis Island, the case of Goddard, right? So if a test administrator uses a test sampled at Westerners or American citizens, then ask immigrants to answer it, would that be fair? Now, the question here of fairness is rather not how fair the test it is, but rather the procedure, right? So, muna siyang controversial siya, no? This assumption. And then number seven is that testing benefits society. So a world without tests would actually be kind of chaotic, right? So imagine a world without tests. So a world without midterms, yes, go for the gold. It's the best thing that will ever happen to me. I could just directly graduate, and then I would get my bachelor's degree. I could get my RPM license right away. But imagine that happens. So, bisag kinsa na lang ang makahatag og kanang kuan, right? Maka-perform sa job. So, sa mga surgeons, for example, if walay testing, no? And who's qualified to hiwa-hiwa there sa imuhang body parts, di ba? So wala rin pagkaiba ang butcher sa baboy ug ang surgeon sa tao. So that's a world without testing. That's a world without assessment. So the assumption number seven is that testing and assessment benefit society. Now these assumptions, kaning seven kabuok, no, is the foundation of everything we do in psychological assessment. So I want you to keep this in mind as we move forward. Okay, so balik ta sa assumption number one. Okay, katong first assumption wherein psychological traits and states actually exist. Unsa man diay na ang trait o unsa pud na ang state? Unsay difference nilang duha? So ang trait, they are relatively enduring. So your personality is one, right? And it's a consistent way where you can differ from other people. So think of it like intelligence ninyo, inyong extroversion or introversion, inyong conscientiousness, inyong artistic ability or inyong creativeness, inyong sensation seeking. Okay, so those are examples of your trait. Now, ang state on the other hand is more temporary. Okay, so it's how you are right now in this moment. So your current mood, your the anxiety that you feel before answering our long quizzes or midterm exam. Okay, so it's temporary. So temporary fatigue is also one after pulling an all-nighter kay on the next day wala namang kaani, right? After you answer an exam, wala din naman ka maka-feel of anxiety. So it's just temporary. So those are states, no? It's more or less enduring. Here's the word, less enduring than traits. So traits exist as what we call constructs. So we'll talk about constructs on the next slide. So sa ng construct, no, we can't see them directly. We infer them from behavior. So when we give someone an intelligence test, we're not measuring intelligence. We'd measure height. So example, say mong height, 150 cm. When you measure intelligence, it does not really measure your true score for intelligence. So we're just making inferences out from that sample of behavior. So when we're measuring a personality, your introversion, we're not really measuring your actual true personality, just a sample of that behavior. And once we get that sample of behavior, we begin our inference or our magkuan ta ba mag-infer. Mao na siya, no? Okay, so I have here a food for thought or question. There's a term na shyness, right? Is it a trait or is it a state? Or could it be both? So how might context affect how shy someone appears? So I want you to think about that. I want you to pause the video, write your answers if you will. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so diba we mentioned construct. Let's talk more about constructs. And a more important thing to discuss as well is error variance. So, saan ang construct? Basically, it's a scientific concept we've created to describe or explain behavior. So, we cannot see them, we cannot hear them, we cannot touch a construct, but we can observe them through overt behavior. And we can make inferences out from this collection of samples of behavior, observable actions or products of actions, including test responses. Okay, so once we get a sample of overt behavior, we can then make infer into describing the measure of such construct. I hope that's clear, okay? So here's something very interesting. Every time we measure something, there's what we call an error variance. So that's the part of the score that comes from sources other than what we're trying to measure. I mentioned that in psychometrics, error is not defined as a mistake, but an actual part of the process. So it should be accounted for. So these are the variables na mga things na naapil ni mo capture pero dili di ay mao. Mura ra gud nangisda ka, di ba? And then if ganahan ka mo dakop og kanang sirena, nakamudakop og mermaid, nya human pagdakop nimo sa mermaid, nay nasagol na mga shrimp. So ang katong error variance ang mga shrimp. Ang katong mermaid mo to ang true score sa kana na construct. So kaning mga examples na to no, mga kanding, mga mermaid, bisag unsa. Okay, so kanang going back. So unsa na sources aning error? Unsa sources aning error? Unsa ning mga shrimps di ay? Number one is that it could be the test taker's factor. Could be when they're answering the test, they had a flu, they were fatigued, they weren't able to sleep for days, or they were anxious. Okay, so when I took the board exam, the second day, wala jud ko katulog. So when ang second day pag yun is psychometrics. So pag take na ko sa exam, nakatug ko in the middle. Okay, imagine that. So I was so anxious before and after sa exam because I was sure as hell na I failed it. So nako, anak ko sa mama ko ipa-pray ra ko ana inyong prayer warrior din na sa inyong office. And then mo to no kanang pagtanan ako sa result ang akong psychometrics ang highest dito, pero honestly lang nakatog jud ko adto kay because of anxiety ba. So that one no ang my anxiety and me sleeping is a factor. This one is source number 2. That's it, and that's a typo. It's supposed to be assessor na factor. So the one that's administering the test. So if you're administering the test and you're not doing it properly and you're not following the manual, you could be a source for error. Okay. Example, if you didn't give out the instructions very clearly, or example, you weren't able to build rapport with the kanang test taker, and now they're afraid to ask you clarifications or questions, then you could be a source for error. And then number 3 is the instrument itself. Okay, so the test itself could contain some error. So some tests are simply better than others at measuring what they claim to measure. So we will understand this more clearly unsa na mga variables ang makainguntang it is a good test as compared to the others. So Kanitanano, it brings us to what's called the true score theory. Ang idea ng true score theory is that everyone has a true score. Our true score in our analogy a while ago is the mermaid, because we want to capture the mermaid, right? And however, we never see it directly. Okay? There's a true score for the mermaid, right? But we don't see the mermaid. What we see is the true score plus or minus some amount of error. So in a personality test, if you're trying to capture introversion, when you get that sample of behavior, you don't capture only introversion. You don't get the score for introversion only. You also capture mga sources of error, or in short, mga errors in assessment. So it's true score plus minus error variance. So, that being said, kung naamoy score sa test, remember na estimator na siya sa inyong performance, behavior, personality, and whatnot. No, it's not an exact measure, just an estimate. All right, so I have here a big question. What makes a good test? So when can you say that a test is good in a sense? Okay, so we have here some common sense. No, even if you don't know anything or the technicalities of what we call a good test, we have a common sense. Now, on the basic level, we know that a good test has clear instructions. Okay, so how to give it, score it, and interpret it. Okay, so there's clear scoring procedures, there's clear interpretation, and it has good utility, meaning there's the difficulty of the test is minimum, or in terms of its administration, by simple siya to use and di po siya naka-expensive. So It does not take forever, meaning economy of time. It does not take forever to answer, or it's also not that costly. And also, it should have adequate norms. So it was sampled very well. So we'll talk about norming in the next few slides. But this one here is what we call the ko ano the kanang common sense when we talk about is the test good, but we have a more technical side to considering whether a test is good, and that is what we call the psychometric soundness of the test. Now when we talk about psychometric soundness, we're talking about two key things, and the first one is reliability and the second one is validity. Unsa man day na ang reliability talks about, okay, consistency. Ano, wag tang nanoon ang letter. Sige na lang na. So, unsa meaning aning consistency? Does the tool measure or produce the same number every time it it is administered? So for example, if you have there a weighing scale no sa imong weight, and for Monday you weighed yourself, and then you have like say 47.8 kilogram. And then for Tuesday, you weigh yourself again, you have 47.8 kilogram. And the afternoon of Tuesday, you have 47.8 kilogram. So we can say that the weighing scale is reliable because it produces consistent numbers every time you use it. Okay? So we'll have an example ani on the next slide. But for now, let's proceed to validity. Okay, so usaning validity, it's about accuracy, it's about precision. Did you really measure what you're intending to measure? For for constructs like for variables, we say weight. Okay, weight, grip strength, those kinds of things. Dili na siya controversial, no? Makaingon ta na the weighing scale really measures weight. And kung ano, reaction time, no, whatever that is, really is the reaction tool really measures reaction time tool. Because the variable in itself, dili man kay siya debatable in iyang definition. But it's different, it's an entirely different thing when we talk about psychological constructs already. Nga naman, I'll give you an example ha. Say for example, I have here an intelligence test. Okay? And I based it or I anchored it on my theory of intelligence, say my Gian's theory of intelligence, wherein I defined intelligence as the students' grades on their long quizzes, say for example. So, meaning for me, I defined intelligence, bright kay ka if dako kag score sa mga long quizzes. Now, the question is, did I really measure intelligence? Or did I just measure students' ability to prepare or students' ability to answer multiple choice, meaning may kasi sila mo-answer multiple choice, right? So wala siguro ko nag-measure sa intelligence test, but their intelligence, but rather their skill in answering a multiple choice exam. So you see where I'm getting at, what makes validity really like a gray area in psychometrics, because dili man all the time na say for example, my tool is reliable. Now each time a student answers it, it produces the same number. Okay, so for example, I let you answer kanang the test and then the same number, reliable siya mo gawas the next time. Pero does it really measure what it is supposed to measure? So this is where it's already crucial. We cannot really say na kanang once the scale is reliable, that's already a good test. No, reliability is not sufficient when we're saying that we need a test to be good. It should be both. No, it should be reliable and it should be valid. Now I have here like kung ano na, not all reliable tests are valid, but all valid tests are reliable. So ang first criteria to kung ano to satisfy is that it should be reliable imong scale or inyong test. And second, it should measure what it is intended, what is supposed to measure. Ang process of validity starts in your item construction to the way you construct and how it's interpreted, and so on and so forth. So kaning validity taas kayo ni siya og process. Okay? So let me show you what I mean with an example. So this is one of my favorite examples when understanding reliability and validity. So imagine we have a certified 1 pound gold bar and we're testing 3 different scales. We have scale A, scale B, and scale C. So scale A reads 1 pound every single time. So it's reliable. It's also, okay, so it's consistent, so it's reliable. It's accurate because it's correct. Okay, say for example, the gold bar is really measured as 1 pound by experts. So, gi-measure na sa experts niya, kadaghan na 100 na nila gi-measure. And every time, different expert measured it, 1 pound jud ang gold bar. Okay? So, it is accurate because this scale reads 1 pound. So, the same siya og measurement sa katong mga experts. And this is what we want. This is what we pertain to if we say that the scale has good or excellent or the scale is psychometrically sound. Now, let's go over scale B. No? So scale B reads 1.3 every single time. Now, is it reliable? Every single time, yes, it is reliable. Kaya every time it is measured, it produces 1.3 na value. Kaya dili maglahi-lahi iyang value. Pero is it accurate? Compared to the measurement sa mga experts in measuring the gold bar for 100 times, it has a zero point 0.3 difference. So, in a sense, dili siya valid. Okay? And then next we have okay, scale C. Now, scale C gives us different readings every time. So 0.9, 1.7, 1.8, 2.3. Now, we cannot say that scale C is reliable. X na siya. And we cannot also say that scale C is accurate because it is not the same measure sa mga expert, which is 1 pound ang measurement sa gold. So, unsay lesson ani? Consistency alone pertaining to scale B is not a guarantee of accuracy. So, a test can give you the same wrong answer every time. So, I have here a discussion or a question for you. So, a personality test consistently shows that a student is highly anxious across multiple administrations. Does this prove that the test is valid? Why or why not? Okay, so if I will answer this, I would say it is reliable, but it is not necessarily valid. Okay, we need other evidence to prove its validity. Okay, to prove that it's really measuring anxiety correctly. Usa man di ay yung theory anchored on the items, asa man siya gikan ato ng mga items, right? So that's it. So now let's talk about norms. Okay, so unsa din ang norms? Lahi ni ang norms sa psychological assessment sa usually madunggan nimo na norms na pag-define sa culture or sa social psychology, no? Lahi ang definition sa norms sa psych assessment. So, example, na ay makascore sa exam og say 75. Kanang 75 na number, it does not mean anything by itself, di ba? Unsa man nato pag-interpret ng 75? So, that's where norms comes in. Okay, so unsa nang definition sa norms? Norms are test performance data from a particular group of test takers designed for use as a reference when evaluating individual test scores. So in short, norms are test performance data from a specific group of people which we call the normative sample. Uy, bati pagkakuan. Dala na, di naman ma-erase. So, mana siya no, bala na na eh. So, na kani siya normative sample, ato na siyang gigamit as a reference point kung how we interpret the number 75. So, example, kani siyang 75, ang question nato is, nakascore kog 75 pero asa ni siya compared against? Is it compared against high school students? Is the normative sample scientists sa NASA? Or is the normative sample elementary school kids? Or compared siya sa general population? So, how do we obtain man di ay normative sample? So, una, mo administer sa test. Then we collect and analyze the score distribution. So, dili na ta mag-plot-plot na sa kanang distribution, kung normally distributed ba siya, o kung sa iyahang mean. Okay? Mean na siya. And then after number 3 is use data as reference for future test takers. So, karon, because we have a normative sample and we said that in the sample of kanang say 1,000, I don't know, ayun lang 1,000, like 50,000 Filipino, ang mean score nila for this intelligence test is say 80. So, na ako some part here, di ba? Kaya 80 man diri ang mean, na ako some part here. So, may pagkaduol ko sa average pero lower than the average ko. So, mo na siya. Now, norms gives context to the number or the raw score na 75. So, now we understand na the reference group really matters because we might have the same raw score, pero kung asa nato siya gi-compare, atong raw score mo change siya og meaning. So, sa din yung mga types of norms, we have the age norms, we have the grade norms, we have the national norms, and then we have the percentile norms. We also have the local norms, subgroup norms, and the fixed reference group. So, this is not part of the norms. Ako lang siyang gi-include here kay kanang para mausa. So, usa ning age norms? Ang age norm is the average performance of a test taker at various ages. So, naay gi-coin na mental age concept. Unsa example sa test, intelligence test na naay age norms or nag-use ani na type of norm is katong Stanford Binet. No, because the way that you calculate the IQ score of the Stanford Binet intelligence test is through the mental age concept wherein you divide it through the chronological age times 100. So for example, yang nakuha na score dito sa test is 12 niya. I-divide nimo siya by, ang child is 12. So ang iyahang times 100 nimo siya. So 1 times 100, ang iyang IQ is 100. So yan na pag-calculate. Now, dili na kayo na controversial kaning mental age na concept because dagan kayo siya technicalities no na wala na addressed. Okay, so let's move on to the grade norms wherein kuan siya kanang average test performance for students in a given school grade. So ang kuan na ni, ang drawback lang ng grade norms is those who are not in school cannot be accounted for. This also includes homeschool children or out of youth children or adults that are not in school. Next is national norms. So panalitan, I want my my test to be representative of the national the Philippine population. So I get samples from region 1 sa 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on and so forth. So those are national norms. Or I have a test of, say, emotional regulation adaptability scale. That doesn't exist. That's just a scale that I made on the spot. So I want to test out whether there are gender differences. So I get a certain percentage of men and certain percentage of women to answer it. So that could also be from the entire population sa Philippines, no? So that's an example of national norms. Now, ang percentile norms are raw scores converted to percentiles showing relative standing. So, for example, naa ka sa 85th percentile, that means you scored higher than 85% of the comparison group. Now, ang local norms, they're developed by specific organizations for their own population. So, panalitan, ako, I have a intelligence score na kinuha sa Western. So, I cannot use the norms there. Kay Western man usually sample ni ang ihang normative sample. So, I develop my own norms based on the local population sa ako ang school. So, na ko separate kanang separate kanang standing sa mean, lain akong mean, ana. So, compared sa kanang original kanang scores katong Western na scale or survey. And then, ang subgroup norms, they are norms segmented by specific criteria. So, we have a one norm and then we segment them. So, panilitan katong Philippine population and then I divide them by region, right? So, that's the norm. So, if I create another norm wherein I look at in a region, how I will also segment them by gender or segment them by socioeconomic status, SES, low ba, middle income, or high income families. So that segmentation, this one, is called the subgroup norms. So sa test manual ni siya makitaan kaning mga details sa type of norms, makita ni siya tanan sa test manual. And it is important for the test users kay if I am interested in understanding the test's sampling in terms of gender for constructs that are gender sensitive, then I can look at how representative that tests were during norm sampling. Okay, so hope that's clear. And the next is we have the fixed reference group, or these are the group wherein there is a kuan siyang fixed reference group. Dili na ni siya kanang norm, na wrong kog kanang na wrong kog design. So, ang fixed reference group, kuan na siya, scoring na siya. So, panalitan na akay intelligence score. So, kani siyang 10,000 kabuok people here. Imagine na lang 10,000 ni kadats ha. Nag-answer siya sa imuhang intelligence scores. Intelligence test. So, ang next takers, so say 2025 taron, 2026. Basta 2026 na nakasabot na mo ana. Yeah. So, ang next few test takers, pag 2027, 2028, i-compare ilahang score against these people. So, kani siya na people are called the fixed reference group. So, meaning, kani siya pag 2026 na sample na 10,000 kabuok nag-answer sa imong IQ, ang 2027 scores, gi-compare sa ilaha ang score sa 2026. Okay? So, mo na siya ang fixed reference group. Okay, so just a caution with regards to percentile norms because we have the percentile. Sometimes it's confused man gud interchange siya ang percentile o percentage correct. Ang percentile, it indicates your standing relative to others. Dili siya ang proportion of items that you answered correctly. So say for example, you have a total of 85 over 100 na score. Pero relative to all psych students, asa man ka na percentile? Okay, so what if naaday ka sa average kay ang kasagaran gyud ay naka-score ana og naka-score og 85. So yan na siya. So how do we actually create these norms? It comes down to sampling. So unsa ni siyang sampling? It's creating or selecting a portion of the population that represents the whole. So let's look at first the key terms. First, we have population. This is the complete universe of individuals with at least one common characteristics. And then out from the population, we obtain a sample which is a portion of the population deemed representative of the whole. And usa ng standardization, it is administering a test to a representative sample to establish norms. So, what are the types of sampling methods? Let's go first with the stratified sampling. Ideally, this is the best sampling to use, but more on that later. Some samplings were developed because of its convenience, because of its ease, and also for budget reasons. Stratified sampling, it means making sure na ang different subgroups are proportionally represented. So, example, imuhang race should have a proportional sample. Example, 50%, 20% of whites, 20% of Asians, 20% of blacks, ganun, no, or gender, 50% male, 50% female, or kanang socioeconomic status, right? So next is stratified random sampling. It's still this one proportionally represented, however na ay additional na random siya, meaning equal chance of selection ang sample na i-appeal no sa norming. And next, we have the purposive sampling is when we pick a sample we believe is representative. So usually companies do this when they test market products in specific cities and also for some research, right? For example, if I just want to test out individuals in the healthcare industry, so there is a selection criteria that they should be working in the healthcare industry. So the other industries, like example, sa retail, sa manufacturing, they're excluded. So that is a type of purposive sampling. If I just want to test out students studying psychology, so that is also included. No, that's called a purposive sampling. And last is we have the incidental or convenience sampling. This is using whoever's available. When psychology studies use students from the introductory psychology psych course, usually it's used because of its practicality. Pero ang kuan ang gyud ani ang bati sa convenience sampling is it is not generalizable jud because of course from the word itself convenience sampling it's who's convenient. You cannot generalize the psych students in introductory psychology course to the whole population. Example, kamura akong use as a norm for the test, I cannot generalize your whole score to the rest of the sample, to the rest of the Filipinos. So I want to introduce now next a distinction in how we interpret scores. So we have the norm referenced versus a criterion reference. So a norm referenced is, well, what we discussed previously, wherein there is a norm and then we compare a raw score against that norm sample. So mana siya ang norm reference group. Okay, so our focus is on this, right? So how does this person compare to other people who took the test? So characteristics ani niya. Scores are interpreted relative to group performance. So it's through rankings, percentile, standard scores, and then there is a kanang an identification with relative to its strengths or weaknesses. So example, anino is si Maria scored at the 85th percentile on the verbal section. And then next, we have the criterion reference testing, which is asking something different. So, ang question niya is, has this person met a specific standard or demonstrated mastery? So, both approaches, they're useful, pero their purpose is different. Ang norm reference, they're great when you need to compare people. For example, you wanna rank college admissions or you wanna identify students for gifted programs. So, not a school for the gifted. Ipangadto sila no kanang mga genius level na mga kids, dito sila ihon. So, nga na siya, useful ang norm reference. Pero criterion reference, it's great when you need to know if someone has reached a certain scale, a specific level of competence. So, for example, driving mastery, right? You have to have a checklist on whether or not you pass an exam. For you to go to the next grade, you need to pass a certain score. You need to have at least 3.0, right? Or 2.5 to retain your scholarship. So, nga na siya, no? So, my question now for you to digest upon this one is a driver's license road test norm reference or criterion reference. So what about ang mga university final exams? Are we using cutoff scores? Because when we are using cutoff scores, we're doing criterion referenced. So next, let's go over to another statistics correlation. No, it's another statistical foundations. But I know in the source that we have, not share computation. We don't worry. We will not do any computations here. because that's too archaic. If you wanna try and compute using the formula, you could to understand the theoretical backings or the theoretical foundations of it, but we will not do any computations. So let's proceed. Correlation rather is simply an expression of how two variables relate to each other, not three, but two. Si x o si y, okay? So ang ng correlation coefficients usually symbolized by the R, okay? And it tells us the degree and direction of that relationship. So kanisha is a perfect positive correlation, no correlation at all, and a perfect negative correlation. In the real world, this does not happen. Kontra na lang no, na naadyo, even this one, no correlation at some point naagid siya like 0.8, 0.90, di ta kakuha og perfect 1. To some degree na ay correlation ang mga butang. Okay? So, go ta sa perfect positive correlation. So, meaning as one variable increases, the other variable also increases. So, they move perfectly together. For example, obesity is correlated, or your weight is correlated to how much you eat sweets in a day. So meaning kung high ka og weight, ang imong frequency sa pagkaog sweets high po. So that is a positive correlation. Kasi nang zero correlation, it means there's no systematic relationship. So meaning wala relationship gyud. No, wala gyud siya relationship. Murag kamo, charat. So next is perfect negative correlation, which means as okay, one increases, the other variable decreases proportionately. So, bali siya. Di pa siya parehas ani ba na as one, ako ikuan ha, diagram. So, as one variable increase, the other variable increase as well. Parehag direction. Kani kay as one variable increase, the other variable decrease. So, panalitan. The higher your family support is, or the higher your kanang social support is, the lower your depression score will be. So that is a negative correlation. So na siya pagkuan, no? Your depression score is negatively correlated with family support. So mo na siya. Okay? So hope that's clear. Now, there are important points that we need to consider. First is ang magnitude, no? The magnitude is judged by the absolute value. So ang negative 85.85 does not mean na mas less siya sa positive 0.85. Ang kaning positive o negative sa correlation, it just points to the direction. So kung ano tag negative, meaning naglahi og direction ang variables. Ang usa ka variable ni increase, so ang usa ka variable ni decrease pod siya. However, if positive ang iyang iyang value sa R, so meaning ana same og direction ang pag-increase sa variable. Pwede po nino, ana, pareha sila ni kuan. Basta same direction. So meaning low scores sa low imong weight, low pud himuhang kanang levels of eating sweets in a day. And unsa nang coefficient of determination? R squared ra gina siya no. So once we get the value of R kanhi sample 0.85, inig-square nimo siya, mo na siya ang coefficient of determination. So panalitan natay R of 0.9. Then atong i-square, so 9 times 9. Diba, may mo siyang 0.81. Nya, imo na to siya percentage, meaning to say 81% sa variance in one variable is accounted for by the other. So, panalitan ta lang ang kaning negative correlation sa family support and depression scores. So, naatay 0.81%. So, 81% is accounted for ang depression scores. No, let me rephrase that. So, example, ang coefficient of determination is 81%. The R squared di mo ang 0.9. So, sa example na to sa depression scores and family support, makaingon ta na 81% ana nila ang gi-share nila na variance. The rest of the percentage is just the error, a chance, or otherwise dili siya ang gina-measure jud, no? Dili siya mao ang gi-measure. So, manata sa kaning correlation, no? Let's move on to scatterplots. O saan din ipag-interpret ang scatterplots? So, scatterplot, it's a visual way to see correlations, usually. So each point represents one person's scores on two variables. So when the dots form a tight line like this one, it has a strong positive correlation. If the dots are scattered or all over the place, then it doesn't have any correlation at all. And if it's moving in this direction, then it has a strong negative correlation. Okay? If it's going downward, iyahang now. Okay? So, unsa may benefits sa scatterplots? It helps us see outliers right away. So for example, na kay bunch of scores here na usad ra ni Simang. So that is an outlier. So unsa may definition sa outlier? These are points that fall far from the others. They might indicate na wrong siya encode or someone that's usually unusual. For example, if you're doing an intelligence test course and there's an outlier, that one score there na taas kaayo, possible na na-ay genius and it takes the exam, right? So, mo na siya. Someone who's usually deviating from the norm in terms of the characteristic or the construct that is sampled. And then, what's yung curvilinearity? It means na dili from the word curvilinear, dili linear ang relationship. So of course, dili ma-apply ang correlation na statistic ani. Other methods for statistics should be used if the relationship is curvilinear. But that's beside the the topic na kay too detailed, too advanced. And then we have kanang restriction of range, no? So limited variability can artificially weaken correlations. So unsay meaning ani? If nag-research ko and then kuhaon na nako mga sample or respondents na ni-score og high sa narcissism na scale. So dili ko kaingon na ang range is unrestricted siya, restricted iyang range. Okay? So lisod na siya igamit og correlation kay putol. Di ba kay straight line ba dapat ang correlation? So mohatag tag example noon. Sa may example ani sa real world. So example, height and weight sa children. It has a positive correlation. So as height increases, so does ang ilahang weight, right? So for another is kanang car mileage and trade-in value. So mas taas kali ang mileage sa car, mas taas iyang kilometers na run through or nagamit, mas magamay iyang value inig paligya nimo niya. Okay, so unsa pa, hat size and spelling ability sa kids age 1 to 9, that has a positive correlation. Okay? Yeah, so ang kuan di ay, by the way, when you have a rank ordered data or small samples under 30, you cannot use Pearson R na correlation. What you use is the Spearman Rho. That is the alternative statistics to use if gamay kag sample and if imuhang data is ordinal or ranked. Okay? So yeah, those are the kuan. Now, there's a famous example wherein ice cream sales is correlated to drowning deaths. Okay, so does that mean that ice cream caused the drowning? So what's really going on? Okay, there's a common example in the kuan ba, misinterpretation probably of how correlation should be inferred. So correlation does not equal to causation. The ice cream did not cause the drowning deaths. They are just correlated because for some reason it was taken during the summertime. So a lot of people were buying ice creams. A lot of people were swimming sa sea. So na increase sa drowning deaths because there are a lot of people. So there is a third variable that could explain the pairing. So, manan naman ta sa kaning correlation, no? So, let's go sa regression. Unsay difference sa correlation ug regression? Ang correlation talks about predicting something, no? Predicting how does X predict Y? So, mo na siya ang mathematical ano niya. So, as a concept, no, regression is the analysis of relationships among variables for the purpose of understanding how one variable in this end is X may predict another in this end Y. Okay, so if correlation tells us that a relationship exists, regression lets us use that relationship to make predictions. So, unsay equation ani niya, mura siyag equation sa slope. Y equals A plus B intercept times X. Okay? So, ang Y ani is the thing that we're trying to predict or the outcome variable. Ang X ani is ang predictor. Ang A is where the line crosses the Y-axis and the B here is the slope. Okay, so how much Y changes for each unit change in X? So how much Y changes for each unit change of X? Okay, remember that. Now, ang naate gitawag pod no na regression line kani siya. So unsang line ang best fit sa distribution or sa scatter plot. So it minimizes the distance between the line and all data points. So kani siya ang distance ani niya sa kanina line, distance kani sa line ani niya, okay? So mo na siya. Karon ang predictions, they're not perfect. So that's why we have what we call the standard error of estimate. So it tells us how much prediction error to expect. So mas grabe gali ka correlated imuhang variables, mas less kag standard error of estimate. Panalitan ka to kanina natay 0.85 R value. So that's very high correlation. So usually gamay tag SE as standard error of estimate as well. And the higher the correlation of X and Y, the smaller the standard error, meaning to say the better predictions we can make out from the variables. Now, when we use a lot of variables, we wanna predict a lot of variables. We're doing multiple regression. So panalitan sa amo ang study before, naa may predictors of street harassment na kung ano unsa may makapa usa na variables ang makapush sa usa ka person to do street harassment. So, does this predict street harassment frequency? So, ang among gigamit is multiple regression. Kaya nga naman, daghan na tag variable na gi-consider, dili ra usa ka single variable, predicting the y, no? Predicting the y. Now, mo na siya, no? So, if we wanna test this out, we use multiple regression. There are more advanced pa no? Dagan kayo multiple regression, stepwise regression, hierarchical regression, but of course, that's already very very statistics na dili na psychometrics, basic na atong ikuan sa diri kay we're understanding this because this will appear again when we're doing item analysis. All right, and we're almost done. Let's proceed muna sa culturally informed assessment. Okay, it's something important to talk about before we end the session. Now, there are various cultural considerations that we need to make when doing assessments. Kay these tests, they're not created in a vacuum. Okay, of course, the test developer creating the test is influenced by their own culture, right? We've already established that we cannot attain a culture free test because culture is embedded in one's person. Of course, tawagog ka, di ba? So, naadyo kay culture, you're participating in you're part of a culture. So, that really matters. So, what do we do in order for us to be ethically responsible, especially with a globalized world already? What should we do? So, first, we need to be aware of the cultural assumptions built into tests. Then, we need to consult with members of specific cultural communities, incorporate methods that complement their worldview and lifestyles, and know alternative tests that may better serve assessment goals. So, if there are more tests that are appropriate for that certain population, then you use that. So, as a professional in the future, as an RPM in the future, that is part of your job, not selecting appropriate tools for its proper or intended use. And then we need to be aware of the equivalence issues like the language, the constructs, right? So we need to pay attention to whether the translated tests are truly equivalent. So if you look at the translated Bisaya version, is it the same? Did it mean the same as the item in the English version? So, for example, if the word hiya is not really synonymous to shame. Pero usually, ang word hiya in English is translated as shame, or in fact, it's not that. So, mana siyang one thing knows, I don't know if naka-encounter na mo Filipino psychology, but that's one construct, one word that's a stark distinction. And a good example of this one, na the word in itself could have layers of cultural notes into it na you cannot precisely translate it, or it has a counterpart in another language. And we need to interpret results within their cultural context. Now, here are the don'ts. We should not. So, we should not assume that a test works the same way for everyone. We also should not assume all communities will find your methods appropriate. Okay? And we should not take a one-size-fits-all na approach sa assessment because igani ang nakabutang sa manual in how you introduce the test. Mo na pwede mong buhaton sa tanang population. What if ang kanang population is naa sa indigenous community? And then kailangan siya more on kanang imo siyang gayran jud on how to do it, how to encircle rather than just saying it verbally, di ba? So dita mag one-size-fits-all approach when we're doing assessment. And then next, select tests without considering appropriateness for assessees. Of course, why would you select an intelligence score na dili siya norm or walay norming or normative sample for minority children, right? And then next is assume translated tests are automatically equivalent. I already mentioned this one here. And then score and interpret in a cultural vacuum. So I have here one last question for you. Imagine there's an IQ test that's developed in the United States and translated into the Tagalog version, given then gipa-answer din siya sa mga Filipino students. What are the cultural considerations that should guide how you interpret those results? Okay, and your answer and this type of questions is exactly the type of questions we need to ask as we move forward sa atong journey as psychology practitioners. Pohon an RPM, pohon an RPSci. Okay? Again, cultural context is not optional. It's not optional. In a world that's imaginary, maybe there is culture free test. No, in a world na parihatang tanan, pero we are different individuals. We have different cultures. We live in different places, raised in different countries, have different beliefs. And so, that means to say na dili gyud ma-avoid. Dili gyud na matangtang ang culture. Okay, it is essential culturally informed assessment is essential when we're doing interpretation. And we're done. Yes, for our key takeaways, let's pull everything together and we have here a total of 5 takeaways. So, number one is that psychological testing rests on 7 fundamental assumptions, no? That traits exist and it can be measured and the whole enterprise benefits society. Just imagine a world without testing, di ba, gubot? And then number 2 is a good test must be both reliable and valid. So, it's not bati siya na test if reliable lang siya because we need to consider its validity. Is it really measuring what it is intending to measure? And the next is norms, okay? They give meaning to test, right? Especially for the scoring or norm reference interpretation of scores. It's providing context for interpreting scores by comparing individuals to a reference group. So there are different types of norms that serve different purposes. And next, we have that number 4, correlation is not causation. Okay, so coefficients describe relationships. It also enables prediction, but they don't tell us that one thing causes another. That's why in psychology usually rare jud kayo ta makaingon na X causes B kay kailangan magyud na siya na ang imuhang laboratory is kuan jud kanang controlled for tanang variables. Nya imuhang subject is human man, mga tao. So, dili ka ka-control tanan jud. So, mana siyang next to impossible ang makaingon tag X caused Y. So, normally in social sciences, what we usually do is we infer, predict relationship. Okay? And then, lastly is that culturally informed assessment requires awareness. So, awareness of what? Awareness of test assumptions, of appropriate reference groups, and of how to interpret results within their proper context. So just imagine, again, a world without tests. That would be a nightmare. So there is a great need for us to use instruments because it helps widely in diagnosis and pointing us to the right direction. So yeah, tests aren't perfect, but when they're done well, they're administered well, they help us make better decisions than we could make without them. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening or for today's lecture. I hope you learned something. And as always, have fun learning.